Lovely to see so many people here today. As Mel said, my name's Patrick Splawa-Neyman. I'm one of the Open Scholarship and Data Services Liaison Librarians here at Monash University, and that long title just means that I help researchers manage their data through the life cycle. So today I'm going to talk about two related projects, the first of which was a data management benchmarking project, and the second one was about researcher assistance. I'll also cover a model to help libraries assess how useful their data management services are to researchers. And I'll finish with my top tips for engaging with researchers, which underpins all the projects that I've done at Monash. So let's start with the Data Concierge Project. This had three main aims. The first of those was to benchmark current data management practices for researchers, but also for graduate research students. It was to identify targeted research data management support so that we knew what services we were providing, what gaps there were, so that we knew in future what to provide, and also to determine whether a data concierge was required. So this is probably a good place to determine, what does a data concierge mean? Is that role someone who provides stewardship in the sense of supervising or taking care of something and getting hands on the data? Or was it more about data management facilitation where I didn't get my hands on the data, but I helped researchers manage their data through the life cycle? Or was it just the term that confused researchers? And the answer is yes, it was a term that confused researchers. So through this project, I really spoke to researchers about this is me trying to help them manage their data through the life cycle. In terms of the methodology, this project ran from May to September 2020, and I worked on this part-time, so I was doing another project elsewhere in the university at the same time. And I identified just over 7,900 researchers to partake in this, and that included graduate research students. So they were randomised, stratified, sampled in proportion, and I contacted them by email. They were all interviewed by Zoom, and the questions revolved around data management through the life cycle. And there was no offer of assistance, so this wasn't me going to researchers saying, I'm here to help you. This was me saying to them, all I want is for you to tell me how you manage your data. And of those just over 7,900 researchers, I interviewed 249 of them, which was about 3.1%, or 1 in 32 of them. So that accumulated about just over 100 hours of interviews. And one of the first two questions I asked, one was, do you have a data breach procedure on the off chance that your data is accessed without your authorization? And the second question was, do you have a data management plan? And you can see from that sea of red, there's a lot of no in there. So the first one on, do you have a data breach procedure? 92% of researchers don't. So they didn't have a way of processing what would happen if their data was accessed. And as that dot point there says, we do have a form called the Reporter Privacy Incident at Monash, but it's largely unknown. And as for the second question of, do you have a data management plan? 76% of researchers said that they don't. And that's not a direct quote there in the bullet point. That is what I've sort of pulled together if I was to come up with a generic quote. Researchers said something along the lines of, my data management plan is in the ethics application. And yes, at Monash we do have an ethics application, and it does have questions about data management planning, but those questions are few and far between and don't constitute what I would call a data management plan. So I think that 76% is actually a woeful underestimate of the number of researchers who have a data management plan. Some of the questions I asked researchers were the tools that they used through the research lifecycle. And I'm not going to go through these in detail, but what I did want to show is that I did ask questions about data storage, data backup, sharing, and also archiving. And I'm just showing the top 7 responses for each of these. But so if we look at storage to begin with, that's the top 7 storage options, but there were actually 38 different tools being used by researchers at Monash. So there's another 31 tools that I'm not showing here, and researchers used up to 4 different tools for storage. For backup, this is the top 7, but there were actually 22 backup tools used. So there's another 15 tools that I'm not showing here. And again, up to 3 tools were used by researchers. This is the top 7 for sharing out of a total of 29. So there's 22 tools that I'm not showing here, and researchers use up to 3 different tools for sharing. And the last one, archiving. Top 7 here, there were 26 tools for archiving used. So 19 I'm not showing here, and researchers use up to 2 tools. So there's a great breadth of tool use at Monash. And just to put that into perspective, for data analysis, it was about 52 different tools. So I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but there's really one theme that I wanted to draw out of these figures, and that is the number of tools that are used across the life cycle that Monash doesn't have any control over. The first of those is Dropbox, which as you can see was the 7th most used tool for storage, 5th for backup, 3rd for sharing, and 5th for archiving. The second tool was an external drive. So this included external hard drives as well as USB. So anything that you could plug into a computer and remove. So number 4 for storage, it was the most used tool for backup, and that was often because researchers said, I don't really trust Monash to back up my data, I prefer to do it myself. Was kind of used for sharing, but it was quite low in the list. And number 6 for archiving. And the last one was a laptop that is not a Monash laptop. So as you can see, looking just at those top 7 for storage, 3 of those are tools that Monash has got nothing to do with. And I did say that up to 4, researchers were using up to 4 tools, so they might have been using Dropbox as well as Monash Google Drive. But what that means is that with all these tools, Monash has no control over the software upgrades. It has no control over security assessments. It has no control over the type of data that's being stored in terms of its classification, whether it's very sensitive or sensitive, and no control over who the data is shared with and by whom. So Monash is blind to a lot of these very important activities. Towards the end of the interview, I asked researchers where they learned how to manage their data. And this one is showing the top 10 of 26 responses. And as you can see, librarians only mentioned out of 5 out of the 249 times. The library website was never mentioned, and the research infrastructure team that I'm a part of, and our sole purpose is to help researchers manage their data, was never mentioned. Now, when I look at these, when I analysed the data, I saw that these methods fell into 2 main categories. And the first of those is what I call the active people-driven method to answer a specific question. So for this one, a researcher is sitting at their desk and they think, I need to do something with my data. What am I going to do about it? And the green dots there are the methods. So the top response there is go to another Australian-based researcher, whether that's a university or a research institute, followed very closely behind by trial and error. Then next came supervisor. So this was the academic supervisor, but that also included PhD candidate supervisor. Online tutorials were quite prominent, mostly YouTube tutorials. And then the last one in that category was online documentation, primarily from a vendor. The second category was what I call retrospective knowledge and passive learning. And those red dots fill in the other methods there. So the top one there is professional development modules. So these are modules that researchers can attend, but it was more so aimed at PhD candidates who have to build up a certain number of hours to get their candidature. Then that was followed by just managing data as they always had, followed by how they manage their data in their PhD, and then whatever industry they worked in or previously worked in, followed by their masters. So as I'm showing here, there's 26 responses altogether, but the library's not really featuring very prominently. And one of the last questions I asked was, if there was a data concierge at Monash, what sort of assistance would you require? And this is showing the top 10 of 130 unique responses. And as you can see, there's researchers are asking for fairly basic information, and they're not looking at websites. They want face-to-face assistance. And if I put a box around that, if you know anything about data management, if you've even read an introductory textbook, none of this will seem surprising to you. It's how do I organize my data? How do I name the files? Where do I store it? How do I back it up? And how do I share that data? Now, unfortunately, at Monash, we're moving towards a tiered model where we're going to be sending researchers to a website first, and then if they can't find the information, they can speak to a librarian. And then if they can't get the information, they can speak to a library specialist. But as you saw from one of my previous slides, researchers can't find the library website, and because they're asking for very basic information, what they actually want is to speak face-to-face to a data management specialist. So that was the Data Concierge project in a nutshell. And when I analysed that data and looked at these graphs, it became clear researchers want face-to-face assistance with a specialist. So that led to the Research Data Management Review Project. And this one had 2 main aims. The first was to provide direct assistance to data management. So the Data Concierge project didn't. That was just saying to researchers, tell me how you manage your data. This one was going back to them and saying, let me help you. And it was also to learn about data management issues as they arose rather than waiting to hear reactively about them. And the methodology for this one was pretty similar. Well, firstly, it ran from March to May of last year, so it was the year following the Data Concierge project. And I excluded the graduate research students and just focused on the researchers. So that left me with 128 researchers, and 36 of them participated. It was also done via Zoom, and the reviews were done in 3 parts. Well, not 3 parts, there were 3 parts to the review. The first of those was to summarise what had been spoken about last year, just to make sure I had the right researcher, but also to clarify that nothing had changed in the last 12 months. The second part was to do the data management review. And this was not me telling the researchers how they should manage their data. This was me working with the researchers to say, what are your needs? Let's combine that with my knowledge to see how we can better support your data management. And then it was followed up in writing. So if this was a pretty straightforward review, it would just be a quick email saying, this is what we discussed. What you're doing is fundamentally correct. Here's some information for you to tweak how you manage your data. If it was a bit more complex, I would send a report in a Word document, maybe 1 or 2 pages outlining what they said, what my recommendations were, and giving them a bit more in-depth information so they could actually act on that. And the topics that were covered in those, this is the top 7 of 13 responses. So no surprise, data breach procedure was at the top there, because so many researchers were just completely unaware of that form. That was the start of the data management review, was to say, you need a data breach procedure, here it is. And also equal first was a naming convention. So for this, I just created some basic information in a PowerPoint presentation, some general information and some specifics with some examples of this is how you manage, or this is how you name your files. For data management planning, I just created a very basic data management plan in REDCap so researchers could access that electronically and update it as they went. Data publishing was a new one that didn't really appear in the Data Concierge interviews. And then you can also see storage, sharing and backup featured quite prominently as well. But there was a very short-term focus on these, and what was not mentioned was a framework for data management or a strategy for data management or how to analyse data, all of which did come up in the Data Concierge interviews. The reason it was a very short-term focus was because I'd already spoken to them for half an hour, and then this review was only half an hour, and in such a short amount of time, you just can't get into data management strategies and data analysis. So they were necessarily quite short. Now, how these issues were resolved, they were resolved in 1 of 4 ways. So the green shows the proportion where I alone, with the researcher, could provide a solution. In the blue there is the library and others. So that was primarily the Monash eResearch Centre and eSolutions. Then the yellow was just others. So that tended to be just Monash eResearch Centre or eSolutions. And then there was 6% unresolved. So you can see from that 4 out of 5 of the researchers that I spoke to, I could help them with the assistance of someone else at the university. And the 6% that were unresolved tended to be researchers who had already tried other parts of the university. For example, they might have said, I want my data to be quicker at uploading. And if you've already gone and spoken to the technical specialists at the university, well, I'm not a technical specialist, so I couldn't help those researchers. Now, of course, at the end of these data management reviews, I always, whenever I speak to researchers, ask for feedback. And one of the questions I ask is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to actually implement what we've spoken about? So 1 was a low score and 10 was high. And you can see it was scored quite highly, not because I'm awesome, but because, as you saw from the previous graphs, researchers are just desperate for face-to-face interactions with a data management specialist just to give them very basic information, which is all I did. So there's a few ways of looking at this data. One way is just to say, well, 42% of researchers scored at a 10 and 58% scored at a 9 or a 10 and so forth. Or if you just like to pick a particular number, you could say the most frequent score was a 10 and the median was a 9 and the average was an 8.7. So this was just really clarified for me that going out and speaking to researchers one-on-one is time-consuming, yes, but very, very valuable to researchers. And I mentioned at the start of this that I worked on the Data Concierge Project part-time. The other project I was working on at the time was to create a data management tracker for the School of Public Health and Preventive Medicine in the Faculty of Medicine, and they're very keen on evidence-based practice. So I thought, can we take an evidence-based model in medicine and apply that to the library to see how well is the data management service we're providing, how good is it for supporting researchers? So here's an evidence-based model from medicine. In the bottom, oh, I don't know why my S is going like that. Anyway, in the bottom is the patient's circumstances. Top right is the clinical expertise of the healthcare professional. And then the left-hand side is the best available evidence research. So I tweaked this a little bit for Monash University Library and ended up with this. So at the bottom, the patient's circumstances becomes the researcher's circumstances. The clinical expertise becomes the librarian's expertise. And then on the left, we still have best available evidence, but I've added in an authoritative body. And what I mean by that is what's the body or the organisational unit at the institution that can endorse how different research tools are used. So if I have a researcher that says I've got very sensitive data that needs to be stored and I need to share that with someone outside of Monash that doesn't have an authcate, how do I do that? Is there an authoritative body that can endorse that? And this is how I think we're going at Monash. I don't think we're doing a great job. First of all, the main problem we have at Monash is that there is no authoritative body. In addition to that, that limits the ability of librarians to increase their expertise, because while I and my co-workers have really good knowledge about data management generally, because there's not an authoritative body endorsing how different tools are used, that really limits our expertise. And because we're not very much encouraged to engage with researchers, that means we're not really taking researchers' circumstances into account. And the knock-on effect of that is that we can't then develop or collect the best available research evidence. So it all stems from that lack of having an authoritative body. So now if we take this and put that into a Venn diagram and then populated that with the three sectors, let's call them, that I just mentioned, we end up with the authoritative body and evidence in the red, librarian expertise in the yellow, and researcher circumstances in the blue. And then right there in the middle, this is what we're aiming for. It's that complete research data management service, because all three of those aspects are being taken into account. But that does still leave us with three sectors, let's call them. And the first one of those is if you have an authoritative body and evidence and your librarians have expertise, but they're not really engaging with researchers, what that means is you might have librarians who are experts, but they're not giving relevant information to researchers because they're not taking into account the circumstances of the researcher. Okay, so this one is if there is an authoritative body and you are able to collect data and taking into account the researcher's circumstances, but if the librarians in the team haven't had their chance to upskill, if for want of a better word, then what that means is that any information given to researchers, the librarians are going to have a lack of contextual experience. So they will have good knowledge, but they won't know when and how to provide it to the researchers best. And then the last one is where I think Monash sits, is that we do have librarians in the team who are experts at data management, and we do a little bit of researcher engagement, but because we lack that authoritative body, effectively what that means is any decisions that we make lack authority and effectively become opinions of the team members. So that's a model that I think is very useful in terms of assessing how useful is your data management service. And that leads me to my last slide, which underpins everything that I've ever done at Monash, which is researcher engagement. And these are my top 10 core principles for engaging with researchers. And I don't really care what sort of research or what sort of area you work in. If you engage with researchers, keep these ones in mind. The first is that time for researchers is a zero-sum game. So if I'm going to researchers and I'm saying, here's all this information you need to implement to manage your data better, that's fine, but researchers are focused on research, and anything I take them away from that research is probably not going to be valued very highly by them. The second one is that data management is a low priority because the focus for researchers is on journal publication and research impact. And we have research misconduct, but there's no such thing as data management misconduct. You might be bad at managing your data, but it's not really misconduct. The third one is that researchers use their own language. So I would never, never, never go to a researcher and start talking to them about fair data principles. I would speak to them about increasing the impact of their digital data, because that's ultimately what you want them to do. So the what is increasing the impact of their digital data. But fair data principles, that's how they do it. So if you're going to researchers and talking about fair data principles, you're telling them the how without telling them the what first. And the fourth one is that if it's not written and from a single source of truth, it's just a personal opinion. And that is fundamentally the problem we have and have had always at Monash. And I keep banging on about this at Monash, and I will until I've got no breath left in my body. We need to have an authoritative body so that we can actually get out and do a good job of supporting our researchers. Number 5 is that from the researcher's perspective, they need help to associate research data management with data protection, not with the administrative and yet another form to fill in. And related to that one from the librarian's perspective is that we help researchers to protect their data and to retain control over their data. And if you are going to researchers and saying you need to comply with policies and procedures and all that, that's a recipe for being ignored by researchers. If you can't enforce it, it's a bit difficult to go at as your strategy with that. Number 7 is to make it very easy for researchers. So any information that they're given has to not be ambiguous, confusing or contradictory. And related to that is that researchers need information that is not only simple, but it needs to be actionable. So a lot of the information we have on the Monash web pages at the moment, it's a lot of information, but it doesn't actually help researchers move along the research life cycle. We bombard them with information, often information that's irrelevant, and that's actually creating work for them because then they need to go away and sort of sift through that information. It's not really actionable in the right way. Number 9 is that researchers need one-on-one assistance with an investigative interview. Nothing superficial here. And what I mean by investigative interview is if a researcher comes to you and says, I need to put my very sensitive data into storage, rather than sending them to the web page that gives them all the options, they need to be asked we need to ask questions of them in terms of the data classification and ownership and who's going to access it and are they a Monash staff member and do they have access to a Monash auth and that sort of thing. And then the last one is that ultimately we must create value for researchers. So for me, I don't really care what the strategy of the library is or the direction of the library. Ultimately, if we are creating value for researchers, that'll be beneficial to the library anyway. So in a nutshell, they are my 2 projects. So the first one was about getting information out of researchers. The second one was using that information to go on and help researchers. And then there was the model to look at how well is an institution actually doing in terms of its service, followed by my core principles for engagement. That's all I wanted to cover today. Hope you found it useful and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yes, Patrick, we do have a few questions here for you. Yeah, first one was, does Monash have a policy on what tools it recommends?
We don't have a policy on tools. We have about 4 different data management policies. We have a website that lists the tools that we have, which is occasionally at odds with what other parts of the university recommends in terms of tools, but no, we don't have that.
Yeah, sounds about right. Next question. Will Monash look into attitudes toward data management or, for example, seeing how, do you have researchers who are like, why should I bother with data management, or researchers who completely ignore policy?
Not really. The obstacle is, as for any university, the main obstacle is not being able to enforce it. So if a researcher doesn't want to follow the policy, well, not much you can do. Yeah. So unfortunately, the answer is no to that. Okay. Not because Monash doesn't want to, but just the case of research is quite powerful, aren't they?
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Next one, and we have just this one and one more. What solutions can you see on the horizon for the lack of authoritative body problem that you have described?
The only solution is someone has to give a crap at Monash and actually just get out there and create an authoritative body and stop talking about it, because there's a lot of talk over the years about the library should be involved, but we have to include eSolutions and we have to include the Monash Research Centre. And I agree with all that, but someone just needs to do it. It's as simple as that. No talk, just do it.
You're inciting a riot here, Patrick. And final question. What sort of ongoing research data management engagement do you have planned to support your researchers?
Well, there's a lot of talk at the moment about research impact. So one thing I'm planning is interviews of about 130 researchers to ask them various questions revolving around how do you define research impact? Does your faculty have a definition of research impact? How have you recorded impact in the past? How do you think it should be done in the future? Just to get a benchmark of what researchers actually think, because there's no point the library determining what support we can give to researchers unless, again, as I keep saying for the last 7 years, you've got to get out and speak to researchers. Yeah, get their opinions.
All right. Thank you very much, Patrick. Please join me in giving Patrick a final round.